And now it's time for Omniversica, the greatest show on the internet, with your hosts, Dan Schneider and Art Durkee.
Welcome to Omniversica. My name is Arthur Durkee. I'm sitting here with my co-host Dan Schneider and co-producer Dave Wesley and our guests Bill Gouette and Blair Scott. The theme for this month's program is religion. Does it make sense? Is it silly? And we're going to be talking in and around this topic for the next couple hours, sort of in a roundtable fashion. So I'll turn it over to Dan to introduce our guests in more depth.
Thanks, Art. We have in studio here a local fellow that I met at a local online Christian group, a fellow named Bill Gouette, but surprisingly he's an agnostic. And on the horn, we have a guy who is the head of a local atheist group down in Mobile, Alabama. And his name is Blair Scott. And before we get into talking about both of the big A's, agnosticism and atheism as belief systems and whatnot, why don't Blair? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your group and yourself? And are you there? Eating babies and what?
Eating babies, sacrificing children on a satanic altar, and just doing everything immoral that I can.
Well, as long as you have someone like big busted brunette like Elvira or Vampira, But tell us a little bit about your organization and yourself.
All right. Well, I got out of the Navy and returned to Mobile, Alabama. That's where my parents were. Wanted my kids to be close to them. And within a month, I had been asked, what church do you go to more times than I had in my entire life? So I decided that there was a need for an organization for people that thought like me to enjoy the fellowship of each other. I mean, atheists need fellowship just as much as Christians and Jews and Muslims do with their local churches. So I originally formed the group as a means to bring like-minded people together. And then from there, we just started to get more involved in the activism level, fighting for separation of church and state, going after the creationists in the state when they tried to put creationism into the science curriculum. And we've even fought for the rights of Christians and Jews in the local area and defending religious freedom. So we're not just looking out for atheist civil rights, but we're looking out for the constitutional rights of everybody. So the group has taken on a more of a constitutional activism role than anything else, with defending of atheist civil rights right there about equally.
So are you a non-profit org, or are you a PAC, or what?
We originally were nonprofit, and then we voluntarily revoked that status in order so that we could endorse specific legislation and specific political candidates.
Okay. Now, maybe just for the few people who might not know, explain sort of, if you would, the background of atheism as a philosophy. I mean, is this something that's relatively new just in the last 100 years, or are there noted atheists going back through the millennia?
No, there's noted atheists going quite a way back. Of course, from my point of view, atheism is our natural state. We're born as atheists. We have to be indoctrinated into religious views. So every baby that is born is an atheist. It's not until they start going to Sunday school that they learn to believe in a higher power or supreme being. Mm-hmm. Our natural state, as developing humans and evolution, of course, I'm sure the Christian audience out there is going, but evolution isn't real. But that we were not the religious people. I mean, the early primates were not religious. Modern primates are not religious. There was obviously some type of necessity for religion to evolve in the species, and I guess we'll discuss that later, so I won't get too in-depth in that.
Okay. Now, just so you know up front, I consider myself an agnostic or irreligious person. It's sort of something that, if I were raised sort of Blue Lagoon style, I can't imagine myself ever developing a religious thought. And I'm going to bring in our other guest in just a moment who's an agnostic. One of the things, though, I've always found interesting or a little disturbing about being an atheist vis-a-vis being an agnostic is, since you can't prove a negative, why not just call yourself an agnostic? To say an atheist, it always seems to me that there's a kind of reactionary, stick out the tongue kind of stance to atheism that you're almost buying into the game and rather than not. And I know my friend Art Durkee here had been replying to another atheist online, and I know he's going to jump in a bit here too. But why are you an atheist and not an agnostic, basically?
Well, I'm both. Uh-huh. They're two separate issues. Atheism and theism deal with belief or lack thereof. Mm-hmm. Agnosticism and Gnosticism deal with the knowledge or lack thereof. They're two separate issues. Someone can be a political agnostic. So I consider myself an atheistic agnostic. Some call themselves an agnostic atheist, depending on where you want the emphasis. The reason I'm an atheist, because the definition of atheism is a lack of belief in gods or supernatural beings. Well, I lack that belief, therefore I'm an atheist. A baby lacks that belief, therefore they are an atheist. Even as an agnostic, if I were to corner you and force you to say, do you or do you not believe in a God, your answer would be, well, no, I don't. Well, technically you are therefore an atheist. But you prefer to use the term agnostic because you don't make any claim either way. But whether you make that claim or not, you still lack the belief, therefore you're an atheist. So atheism is not an anti-theist stance. I mean, I support the right of the theist to believe whatever they want.
Okay.
Atheism is not really a stick your tongue out at religion, although there are people that use it for that. From my point of view, atheism is just it's a label basically for what I am. I lack belief in God. Atheos, without God. That's what I am.
One of the things that always intrigues me about atheism versus theism is that admittedly we live in Western culture, Euro-American culture which is based upon the history of Greek, Greco-Roman culture and Middle Eastern culture, the Jewish, Christian, Islamic thing. But I spent my childhood living in Asia. I was actually a mission brat. And the thing that's interesting to me is that whenever I hear atheists talk about, well, do you believe in a God? The problem that I always come up with is, well, what do you mean by God?
Right.
Because, in fact, Hinduism is not particularly theistic because the gods are viewed as representations of natural forces, sort of like avatars versus or embodiments in a way that a person can talk to.
Right, incarnations of Vishnu.
Or incarnations of whatever.
Right.
Vishnu actually, I don't want to get it. That's a whole nother topic. But Buddhism is in fact pretty much a non-theistic philosophy and not a religion. Right. 1 out of every 3 religions worldwide are atheistic in nature. They don't have a god that they worship. Right. Exactly. Well, the God that atheists and agnostics and even Christians deal with, and this comes back to what Dan was saying earlier about, well, we seem to accept that the same fundamental assumptions go on regardless of what we think about them. See, I have a problem with that because that particular image of God is very much Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition and Zoroastrian too. It's a Middle Eastern desert religious concept. Right. Unfortunately, we've been thrust in a position where we have to constantly defend ourselves against the Abrahamic religions because those are the 3 primary religions worldwide. Right. And the side religions of, like Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Asatru, Odinism, paganism, Wicca, blah, 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 they just get kind of lost in the fray and we forget to think about those. So the biggest question I ask people when we get into a debate about whether God exists or not, and just for clarification based on what was said earlier, from my point of view, I don't have to prove that God does not exist. Because you're right, I cannot prove a negative, so I don't need to prove that God does not exist. I don't make the exceptional claim. But one of the things that I ask people initially in a debate is, define your God. Right. I cannot debate God unless I know your definition of God. Right, exactly, yeah.
I agree with that.
Now, just chiming in here was Bill Gouette, and Bill is here in our Twin Cities studio. Now, Bill, I met you on an online group, and you described yourself as an agnostic. Now, would you find yourself in agreement with most of what Blair has said, or are there some points that you would like to differentiate yourself as a capital A agnostic, or are you a lowercase agnostic?
I'm a capital A agnostic.
Is there a church for that?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Maybe there should be.
There is an agnostic church, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
Well, I originally came from the atheist crowd, and it was tough to defend an atheist position to be such a like your guest just mentioned about a negative, and you're always on the defense. And some other personal issues that surround me in my life, I decided that I have to move from that position, so I moved into the agnostic position. But a lot of the times I've explained it or defined it as what you would be like a right-wing agnostic or something, like a strong agnostic, borderline atheism, almost strong atheism, but with enough agnosticism in you to think that, okay, I am open to some other input if you can offer me something to change my point
So you
of
keep
view
an open mind.
Keep an open mind. So that's where the agnosticism comes in.
Okay.
But for the most part, it'll stay atheist.
Now, let me just ask both Bill and Blair. I think there's a fundamental difference between a belief, let's say, in a higher power, a God, or a deity, and a belief, for example, in, say, the possibility of something, an after death or an afterlife. I mean, I think it's scientifically possible that there could be some energy. I mean, do either of you entertain the idea that, you know, there could be some kind of post corporeal existence, and, you know, even aside from a God? Let me just go with Bill first.
Yeah, I wrestle with that quite a bit. I tend to believe or see that there is definitely some sort of energy or force throughout the universe. There seems to be something that fine-tunes it and brings it together in kind of a musical song. And there's things that'll keep me awake at night that'll say, you can't believe in this crap, you ain't going nowhere but in the ground. And there's other times when you think, well, there's just, this universe is just too big, there's just too much in it, there's too much to know, and our little minds can't know it, and we're all bound by, you know, the quantum level and through atoms and energy, that there's got to be maybe a possibility of something else in energy form that's out there. But will a human ever understand it as form of a god or anything else that you can label it as? No.
How about you, Blair? Do you entertain even the possibility of an afterlife? Or
sure. I mean, the way I look at it is this way. Anything is possible. I mean, it's possible that pink unicorn exists.
Yeah.
I mean, anything is possible. It's possible that leprechauns really walk around in Ireland, you know. But I prefer to deal in the realm of probability versus possibility. But that doesn't mean I don't ignore the possibilities completely. My mind is completely open. I'm not a static atheist. If new evidence were to be presented to me to prove that any of the gods or supreme beings or higher powers or whatever actually existed, then I would change my position. I mean, I'm not in a situation where I'm completely static and, you know, it's no, I refuse to believe, I'm not going to listen, blah, 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 blah. You know, I'm not sticking my tongue out at anybody. I'm like, look, this is my position. I'm open, my ears are open. If you've got the evidence, give it to me and I'll change my position. I'm more than willing to. I admit that I might be wrong, but I can only base my conclusions on what I do know, not what I don't know, which is why I put the word atheist in front of my agnosticism, because I do deal in what I do know and not what I don't know.
How about a feeling rather than a proof? A personal deep conviction, a feeling of hope rather than a proof. Rather than somebody prove to you that there's new evidence for you to believe something else, just a personal, quiet, in your closet type belief that, you know, that there's a possibility without having any kind of proof.
Well, right. Well, I don't deny my spirituality. I consider myself a spiritual person.
Okay.
Just for, you know, for the audience benefit, I am a Unitarian Universalist. I do attend church every Sunday at the local UU in Mobile.
Okay, a lot of people's eyebrows go up when somebody says that.
They attend a church, yeah.
Partly because the UU are so inclusive that people sometimes wonder. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want you to talk more about why the UUs. Okay.
Yeah. Why there's two big reasons. One, just like you said, they're all inclusive. Basically, their mindset and their philosophy is come into our house and however you believe is fine with us. They think that each individual needs to find their own path. And at the UU in Mobile, there are liberal Christians, Jesusians, Wiccans, pagans, atheists, agnostics. I mean, you name it, they're there. I think there's even a guy that celebrates Native Americanism. You know, so I mean, it's a hodgepodge of beliefs, and the great thing about it is everybody's respected.
Okay.
Everybody's allowed to state their opinion. At the end of each service is a 5 to 10 minute time frame where people can ask questions and state their opinions. I've never seen that at any other church, where you can actually talk back to the person that's giving the presentation. And that's just incredible, because no matter how much people disagree, they walk away with respect for each other, because that's what it's about. It's about communicating ideas And tolerance comes through communicating ideas. We're intolerant because we don't communicate with each other.
Well, I have to say, one of the things with the show is for people who listen, I to a guest beforehand, I try to send out a syllabus of some of the things we're going to discuss, and this is one of the things, though, where we go off on a tangent, because one of the original guests that I had was my friend Joe Homrich, who is an atheist, and Art had an email correspondence regarding an essay that Joe had put up on my Cosmoetica website, and I met Joe about 10 years ago at the Unitarian Universalist Church up here in Minneapolis, and I met him at a single group, and both he and I admit we were there for the women, but I have to tell you though, Bill I met at this there's a local radio show host here in the Twin Cities, and he has a group of Christians that I was arguing with, and they're basically your typical right-wing anti-abortion kind of Christians,
kind of reactionary.
But yeah. I have to say, the Unitarians that I met were politically correct, left-wing, tree-hugging bigots, every bit as intolerant as the right-wing Christians. And I have to say, it disappoints me a lot more. And I don't know, maybe it's different with you, with your Unitarians, but the few Unitarians I have met have been as closed-minded as anything I've ever found from Jerry Falwell or any of that ilk.
Right. Well, with every Unitarian church, just like any other church, you got to find one that fits your personality, and every UU church is different. There are some UU churches that are predominantly Christian and are obviously Christian in nature, and I would never feel comfortable in a UU church like that. Mm-hmm. There are some that take on a really strong environmental role to the point where it's tree-hugging fundamentalism, and I would never be comfortable in there. Mm-hmm. I love a tree, but cut the thing down to build my pharmacy, and so I'm not right-wing leftist either. Yeah. And so I think I can't speak obviously for every UU. But the UU in Mobile is not like that at all. We've opened the door for anybody and everybody. We've worked with the Interfaith Alliance and other local churches and tried to be as open as possible and tolerant as possible. I love that church down there. It's one of the best churches I've ever been to. And obviously I'm biased because I attend there, but I have been to other UUs that are just like that one. And I've been to UUs that are the ones that you described, where I really felt uncomfortable in there because I felt that it was they were not open to any discussion at all, and anybody that disagreed with them was going to be frowned upon.
Well, go ahead, Art.
Well, what you're saying reminds me of frankly, Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, which is an Episcopalian, I believe, high cathedral with a bishopric and everything. They're basically, in terms of their Christian high rights, only one step away from the Catholics. However, Grace Cathedral is one of the most inclusive places I've ever been. They have an age shrine in there. They have 2 labyrinths for people to do walking meditation with, indoors and outdoors. They are completely inclusive. And they have all kinds of ecumenical outreach things going on. So maybe the real issue here is the hierarchy of the organized religions dictating dogma versus an individual, right. Collection of people who decide that they want to hang out together. You can call it worship, you can call it prayer, you can call it sitting quietly one day a week just to check in, right. Which is kind of what the Society of Friends or the Quakers calls it, actually. How about that? I mean, in terms of, what's the real issue here? Is the real issue somebody believing what they believe, or is the real issue tolerance?
Right.
I don't know, maybe a little bit of both. I think, I don't know, from the UUFM and from my particular point of view, I consider, I'm tolerant to a degree. There are some things where I'm like, no way, absolutely not. This is just absolutely wrong. I mean, there has to be a level. You can't be completely intolerant. There has to be some type of tolerance level. When an abortion doctor is shot because of religious beliefs, obviously I'm intolerant towards that. Mm-hmm. When they hang pictures of aborted babies on the freeway so that my kids see it as I'm driving down the freeway, I'm intolerant of that. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I tell people all the time is that you have the right to believe whatever you want to believe, but you do not have the right to have those beliefs respected.
Yeah, and I agree with that. It's interesting. Here's another tangent. Here in Minneapolis, I used to work for the Hennepin County, and I worked in downtown Minneapolis, and right outside the Metrodome, for about 6 months, there was a big billboard called Pro-Life Minnesota, and it said babies are our most natural resource, or our greatest natural resource, and there were 13 babies. I counted them, and they were all white. And here's one of the things I've always found interesting is that religion, and whatever kind of religion, always seems to be imbued with intolerance of one sort or another, whether it's racism or bigotry. And I think it gets to the idea that I think religion, in my view, is fundamentally deceitful. It plays on people's weakness. We have had a ex-governor here, Jesse Ventura, the pro wrestler, and probably the only thing I agreed with the man in his 4 years as governor, he said something to the effect that religion is for the weak of mind and weak of heart.
Well, he got a lot of hell for that, didn't he?
Oh, he did.
And then, like a true politician, he turned around a couple of days later. But I'm wondering if that's one of the things that has drawn you outside of the religious realm. I've always just found a fundamental deceit, whether it was when I was 9 years old and I was outside my pastor's rectory or whatever you call it, and heard him talking about taking the collection plate money to buy a Ferrari, or just dealing with regular kind of the fundamental little things that can't be explained. And I'm wondering, both for Bill here in studio and for Blair, what level this sort of slinking deceit might have in your turn from religion.
You want to go first?
No, go ahead, Blair.
Okay. I think the deceit works, to a really large degree in bringing people in. That's obvious. I mean, just look at the recent turn that the churches that in Mobile, the area, have taken, which I call Fort God because of the largest churches I've ever seen. One of the things that they do now is they offer free skating at the skate park, but only if you listen to a 30-minute sermon. Well, to me, that's a little deceitful because you're bringing these kids in, they're thinking they're going to skate for free, and then when they get there, they find out that they have to listen to a 30-minute sermon. And then you hear about that guy in Iraq, the chaplain in Iraq that was telling guys that they could take a bath in his 500 gallons of water if they promised to get baptized and listen to an hour and a half of, so these guys come down thinking they're going to get a bath, and then they find out they got to listen to an hour and a half sermon and get baptized. The deceit, to me, if you have to use that type of methodology to get people to come to your religion, then your religion cannot sell itself on its own.
Right.
Bill?
And what I find deceitful, especially what started the conversation with the pro-life movement, is when they're talking about abortion and pro-life, they want to. Most people on the right will want to save, or religion will draw you in, saying you got to save life, protect it, yada yada yada. But they want to protect the little white baby. When it comes to be a little black baby, has no father, and the mother's running around, Asian babies, the rest of it, they don't want to have anything to do with them. They don't want to support them. They don't want the government programs to help them out. So they'll bring you in and say that you got to save all this stuff and save life and save this and this and this and that. And then once they accomplish that goal, they turn their back on it.
Well, religion.
If I may, real quick, just talking about the abortion signs, I was driving through Missouri, just south of St. Louis, around Farmington, and around that area, there's a whole bunch of these anti-abortion signs all over the place, and they had a number that you could call. What? And just for S&G, I called this number and asked that very question: why all the babies on the billboards were white? And the answer I got was so quick and so pat that it was because the blood doesn't show up on African American babies. You can't see the blood on the posters.
Really?
And I was like, okay, that answer was way too pat and way too quick. I mean, I guess it makes sense, but it's like somebody thought of that as an after fact.
Right.
It was obvious that the answer was prefabbed.
And it made me think earlier to when Dan said that there's no minorities on that billboard.
Well, another thing too, Bill, I had met at this group, and code is very, very ingrained in religion. And, I grew up in New York, and I remember one incident that has nothing to do with religion where I was working at a supermarket and someone had shoplifted, and I was in a car with two cops, and they did something to one of the shoplifters and sort of looked at me. They did something illegal, and it was a sort of like, what we're doing, but you're not going to say anything. And I, smiled, men with guns. But people in religion do the same thing. There was a fellow at this group that I met Bill at who when they one time at the live group that I went to, they were talking about abortion, and he sort of poked me in the ribs and leaned over and said, abortion is what they want to do to us. Now, the they, I would assume, means, I've been around long enough to know that means minorities, usually directed by sinister Jews, and the us, the good white Christian folk. And so that's one of the things that, you have these code terms. Another code term that was used with things like shiftless people when you talk about welfare, and you're not supposed to know who they're talking about, or, we should take pity on gays, or these kinds of things, which, how can you say that we're bigots if we want to show pity and mercy to people, and...
Because it's misguided pity and mercy.
All right.
Now, one of the things, too, I wanted to just touch on, and... we got about another 5 minutes or so to go in this segment. Secular ethics versus religious morals. I've always thought there's a fundamental difference between morals and ethics, that ethics are something that come from within and is secular based, whereas morals are something that are imposed from the outside. Do either you, Bill, or Blair, if you want to go first, do you see a difference between the two?
I do see a difference between the two. I think I can agree with what you just mentioned there. Ethics coming from inside or a secular point of view, and morals coming from the outside. We can, as a society or group, we can set our morals, and we can all vote or agree on whether that's a right moral or not. And some of our personal ethics we can come about on our own. I think I'd have to agree with that.
Blair?
Yeah, I would tend to agree as well. I think there's a if you will, a genetically built-in ethical code based on our kind of mission in life, so to speak. To propagate children, to raise those children, etc. And those ethics tend to revolve around that, and then the morals, of course, are societal. Let's we're going to morality police here. Let's put helmets on kids that ride bicycles. Well, even the social morals that we have tend to revolve around the object of the species. Let's protect the children. Let's protect life. Let's make sure that people get to live their lives, etc. I mean, we obviously know if you kill somebody, it's a one-way trip. They're not coming back. You just took away the ability of the species to propagate. You hindered the species from going further. So murder is wrong. And then, of course, you have to get into the issue of one of the things that I like to talk about is happiness. What is the greatest level of happiness? And of course, some will tell me, but the rapist is happy when he's raping. Yes, he is, but the rapee is not. So it's not achieving the greatest amount of happiness. Therefore, it isn't a moral act.
Okay, I'm going to argue against that for a moment, just for the sake of logic. I tend to view morals as a tribal thing and ethics as an individual thing. And we are born into our tribes. Our birth tribes are our family, our city, our county, our culture, what we see on TV, the beliefs that we were raised. And the individual, as you individuate in the sense of the psychological Jungian term, it means becoming a whole integrated person on your own, irregardless of what other people tell you. I think ethics belong in that. Now, the thing about the psychology of this is that I personally believe that no rapist is ever happy because they're fundamentally unhappy, or they wouldn't be doing that. There's no joy there. That's purely a power over situation. It's not even about sex. It's certainly not about pleasure. It's definitely about power. So I don't think happiness comes in there at all. In terms of the murder instance, well, I agree that it is wrong to deprive somebody of their existence on this planet. However, there are plenty of spiritual masters of whatever religion, and this is something that comes up all over the world all the time. So maybe it's wish fulfillment, or maybe there's something there. But, it's like the Zen masters say, who dies? Nobody really dies. So, that doesn't mean that you can go around sanctioning murder or anything like that, but there's another level in which to think of that. There's kind of a symbolic level that transcends even the individual level. And I think that morals are definitely a tribal thing, and ethics are definitely an individual thing, but there's another level, and that's a transcendent symbolic level. And I'm not so sure that my personal ethic really is going to have anything to do with with that higher level. I'm articulating this not too well right now.
Well, I mean,
I want to.
okay, go ahead.
One
Bill.
thing, just one small thing
Wrap this section up.
with murder is when you deal with murder, as far as for the species. If you're dealing with evolution for the best part of the species to go on, then it'd be okay to murder in some instances to kill the less. I don't know what word I'm searching for.
Natural selection.
Yeah, you'd want to kill certain people because you don't want them to continue. You want to kill out like the Jerry Falwells or somebody because you don't want them to continue to propagate their message. But there's the other part of the species you'd want to continue. So how would you argue that moral on what is correct and what is not correct?
Well, of course, what you're getting into there is eugenics,
right.
which is
right.
very immoral doctrine. But
well, okay, now we're going to end this segment because we're running late. But personally, let me just say, I disagree with Art in that I don't think you can parse. I think when the rapist's dick is ready to shoot his load, I think there's joy involved.
There's pleasure there.
It's pleasure, and you can argue this existentially or whatnot. As far as now I forgot what Blair just said, but one plug before we go out to end the segment. A great 1950 sci-fi film with Harry Belafonte, The World, the Flesh, the Devil. It's a great B flick. It's about the last three survivors of an atomic holocaust, a black man and two white people, and it's all about that. It is really a moralistic play on human society. But anyway, we're gonna end on a light note this segment, and we're gonna hear a comedy piece from a local Twin Cities comedian named Ari Hoptman. And when we get back, we'll be talking more about atheism and agnosticism with Bill.
Hello and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Nigel Macmillan live in Berlin with coverage of the Chancellor's speech at the opening ceremonies of the Circus of National Socialism here at the Sports Palace. It is a beautiful day in Berlin, a slight breeze coming in from the north, pushing out, as one man put it, the foul stench of communism from the east. The happy and eternally blissful German youth are ready to be entertained, and the finest clowns, acrobats, and National Socialist fire eaters have been gathered here to show the people. And here he comes. Here comes the Chancellor through the side entrance. He looks confident. He looks very secure in his newly acquired dictatorial powers. He acknowledges the crowd in a not very friendly way. And as soon as the crowd have died down from their frenzy, we will hear the voice of the Fuhrer. And as I understand from the Ministry of Propaganda, we will be hearing some personal remarks before his official statements. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chancellor.
Meine Geliebte,
My beloved.
in letzter Zeit bin ich zu einigen wichtigen Schlüssen gekommen hinsichtlich unserer Liebe.
I've recently come to some important conclusions with regard to our love.
Die möchte ich hiermit ausdrücken in diesem meinen Liebesgedicht an dich.
I would like to express these in a love poem to you.
Schätzchen,
Honey Wannykins,
du bist die Sonne und der Himmel.
you are the sun and the heavens.
Du bist das Gras und die Bäume.
You are the grass and the trees.
Du bist wirklich alles, was schön ist.
You are truly everything that is beautiful.
Im Vergleich zu dir bin ich ein Bottich Abwasser.
Compared to you, I am a vat of raw sewage.
Ich bin so ein Tor,
I am such a fool.
weil ich mich in dich verliebte.
And because I fell in love with you.
Aber ich wusste sofort, sobald ich dich sah,
But I knew right away as soon as I saw you.
dass du die Frau seiest, die mich glücklich machen würde.
That you would be the woman who would make me happy.
Diese Augen,
These eyes,
diese Lippen,
these lips,
die Reinheit deiner Abstammung,
the purity of your heritage.
unsere Liebe
Our love
ist eine wahre Liebe.
is a true love.
Sie ist eine echte Liebe.
It's a genuine love.
Sie ist eine nicht-semitische Liebe.
It is a non-Semitic love.
Ich befinde mich ständig in arischer Unsicherheit.
I am in constant Aryan uncertainty.
Liebt sie mich?
Does she love me?
Oder ignoriert sie meine germanischen Schmerzen?
Or does she ignore my Germanic pains?
Dieses Gefühl wächst in mir wie ein riesiger Pilz.
This feeling grows inside me like a giant fungus.
Und ich frage mich jeden Tag, jede Nacht, ob es für dich auch so ist.
And I ask myself every day, every night, if it's the same for you.
Also sag mir, dass du mich liebest.
Tell me that you love me,
Dass du mir immer zur Seite stehen wirst.
that you will always be at my side,
Damit wir zusammen in das Königreich der Liebe einmarschieren könnten
so that we might together invade the kingdom of love,
und über diesen Feind, den wir Einsamkeit nennen, siegen könnten.
so that we may conquer this enemy that we call loneliness.
Sieg!
Sieg.
All right, we are back here talking about the two big A's, agnosticism and atheism, with in-studio guest Bill Gouette and Blair Scott from the Mobile Atheists. We ended last segment getting in a bit of a row here, exchanging ideas back and forth. But
Fight!
but I think I want to sort of go back to the beginning here, and sort of maybe this is where you cue the wavy flashbacks if this was a movie, and talk about how ideas of how religion got started. And a friend of mine, Joe Homrich, who posted an essay defending atheism on my website, had recommended this book by a fellow named Pascal Boyer called Religion Explained. And I found it to be quite a turgid book, very overwritten, and as a writer, it's hard for me to get past something that's poorly written, even if I agree with the basic premise. But nonetheless, the book basically posited that religion was evolutionarily bound, and I don't know if either, I guess, are familiar with a book by Daniel Dennett called Consciousness Explained. It was a book in that kind of vein, trying to find evolutionary and genetic reasons for why people would believe. The basic thrust being that religious belief is far less costly. And the one example that my friend Joe used in the book was that suppose there are two cavemen. Caveman A is always fearful of things, and 99 times out of 100, when he runs away thinking there's a tiger behind the bush, he's wrong, but there's no cost to pay. The other caveman, Caveman B, is the skeptic, and 99 times out of 100, he's wrong, but the one time, he's right, but the one time that he's wrong and there is a tiger behind the bush, he's eaten. So that evolutionarily, fearful people, i.e. religious believers, have proliferated. So that's the basic thesis of that book. Now, I know Art Durkee had some ideas, so Art, why don't you opine a bit, and then we'll bring in Bill and Blair for any comments.
Well, I'm going to take the mystic's perspective on this rather than a theistic or atheistic or agnostic position on it. Basically, you know, my response to that kind of arbitrary lady or the tiger, or excuse me, Bush or the tiger kind of dilemma is that, well, it's an interesting logical dilemma, but there are always other options than those two. Maybe, in fact, if you look at, you know, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle or Schrodinger's cat, those concepts from contemporary quantum physics, in fact, until somebody looks behind the bush, the state of matter there is that there is a tiger and there is not a tiger. That both conditions are true until you actually go behind the bush and look. Right. You know, so there's one of the problems I have with this kind of reasoning is the fact that we fall into these either or kind of dilemmas, and whenever you have an either or, it tends to polarize the thing. So, you know, a lot of the arguments around atheism versus religion are like, you either are or you are not. You know, it's yes or no. And one of the biggest problems I have is the fact that either or never tells a story. It's very black and white and very legalistic. And it may be logical, but there are other kinds of logic that are more inclusive. I personally find fuzzy set theory to be a lot more interesting because it talks about groups in relation, and you can have things interacting with each other, but you don't necessarily know where the boundaries of each group are. So there's a gray area, there's blurriness. I'm reminded, to use a literary example, of Virginia Woolf writing in one of her essays, life is not a series of gig lamps neatly arranged going down a lane. Rather, it's a sort of luminous fog. So there's light there, but you don't know where it's coming from. So I guess my position would be to take a third position in that neither A or B is true or false. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think reality is more both and rather than either or. And I think that, in fact, there's a whole new paradigm shift going on in the world right now that tends to go for both and consciousness versus the old paradigm of either or consciousness. I see this in a lot of different areas. I think there are people who are in the so-called New Age who are all about this. And admittedly, the New Age is full of flakes. And there are, 5% of those people are actually pretty authentic and have something interesting to say, too.
Blair, how do you think, do you have any hypotheses on how religion formed?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that lend to religiosity. Obviously, the fear factor plays a huge role in it, the fear of death. That's why the belief in afterlife is such a major doctrine of most religions, especially the God religions. And even the non-God religions believe in reincarnation or release of energy. Your energy becomes part of the universe, the Gaia theory, all that kind of stuff. So all the religions tend to associate themselves with living beyond the mortal world. But at the same time, there's obviously no proof at this point that religion is evolutionary in nature. But the research is really intriguing. And it's under neurotheology, if you want to call it that. And basically what happened was they were doing research on people that had epileptic seizures. And people that have seizures, when they come out of seizures, they always say that they've had major religious experiences during the seizures. And so the research was, well, let's find out why they're having these religious experiences during the seizures. And what they found out that there was a specific part of the brain that was in overdrive, just full of electric activity in the neural nets during the seizure. So once they identified that part, which of course authors immediately came out and, the God part of the brain, it's religious, we got a religious part. And it's like, well, wait a second, let's do some research here and find out what's going on before we jump to any conclusions. And even if there is a God part of the brain, if you will, that still doesn't prove or disprove whether God exists or not.
Well, Stephen Hawking is to blame for the God prefix attached to so many things, the God particle, the God this, the
right.
God, But, Bill, how about you? Any ideas from yourself?
You guys are great. Some big thinkers here.
He's a lunch pail thinker.
I'm a lunch pail thinker. I'm much more simpler than that. For me, it comes down to something as simple as early ancestors just didn't know where fire came from, where the sun came from, and they just decided to, and they couldn't deal with their concept of death, and as far as until the burial rites started to come into play, and they started to build up different artifacts and beads and stuff, and then started to pass down stories, and the stories got passed down through generation, so that it evolved through storytelling. I think it's just as simple as lightning made fire, and it must have come from somebody else, so let's invent a story, and it's been passed on since.
Well, myth is generally discarded religion, and religion is basically, myth up close. And, it's interesting, too, because I've always had an interest in a lot of things, unexplained phenomena. I believe, for example, 100% in unexplained phenomena, but I don't believe in unexplainable phenomena. And I think there's a difference, and I'm going to read in a little bit a section from a book on UFO lore that has some eerie kind of parallels to contemporary religion. But, in my mind, there's a famous UFO researcher named J. Antonio Huneeus, and he had probably one of the best articles post 9/11 that I ever heard. And, I don't know how familiar with UFO law you fellows are. I know Dave Wesley, our host, our producer here, does a UFO show, but UFO cult thought has often been thought of as being the 20th century's only really new started religion. But it was interesting because the Huneeus article said that one of the real fundamental belief systems in UFO religiosity, if you will, is that there is a government conspiracy. And yet here, that whole fundament was knocked out when a couple of, terrorists came with box cutters and were able to hijack and crash planes into a building. And, this whole Area 51, and we're hiding aliens and this, that, the Masons, the Jew bankers, this, that, and the other thing, all of that. it's pretty hard to rationalize that big a construction when something gets kicked out. And I've always just wondered, there has to be that kind of an underpinning to your more established religions, and I'm just wondering when there's going to be that kind of an incident that knocks the underpinnings out from under it. And do you, Blair, or does anyone, Art or Bill, have any speculations on what kind of event that might be?
There haven't been any major ones as of yet. There have been minor ones here and there. Religion evolves, and it evolves because of the environment. For example, flat Earth.
Do you mean the cultural environment?
Right, the cultural environment, the scientific environment,
physical landscape.
It's forced to evolve at some point or another, or it's forced to collapse. Christianity absorbed a lot of the pagan rituals because if they didn't, Christianity would not exist today.
Right.
So they evolved in order to convert the pagans. When they realized that the world was round, the religion evolved to reflect the round Earth. When scientists discovered that the sun is the center of the solar system, they went from a geocentric to a heliocentric the way they were supposed to. They were forced to evolve, otherwise they would lose credibility. And I think what we may be looking at now is the beginning of the fall of literalism. If you look at the creationist movement, it's really just a small vocal minority that is a literal creationist. Yeah, most of them are intelligent designers to the point that, look, we're Christians, but we believe in evolution. God used evolution to make mankind. And I think the reason you see that is because the science of evolution, whether you believe it or not, has inadvertently stabbed at the very heart of Abrahamic religions at a minimum. If there was no Adam and Eve, then there was no original sin. If there was no original sin, then Christ died for nothing on the cross. The religion is meaningless.
Actually, there is a whole new growing trend right now that is very much in alignment with what you just said. And in fact, it is a mystical thread that has always existed going back to medieval Christianity, but it has been vilified, deemed heretical, and persecuted by the organized, church hierarchy. And that is the creation-centered theology, which is not a fall redemption theology, not an original sin theology, but an original blessing theology. Okay, and it's very much a growing kind of thing that's been going on now for about 25 years. In the forefront of this is people like Matthew Fox, who's a writer, and he was kicked out of the Dominicans by the Vatican because he's basically was preaching against them, or rather they didn't like what he was saying, as well as many others. But the basic point there is that, even the medieval mystics who are considered fathers of the church, like St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila, both of whom are declared fathers of the church, were creation spiritualists, not original sin people.
Right.
I find that incredibly interesting.
Well, talking about, just to jump in, one of the guests that I wanted on was my friend Joe, who's an atheist, and he often gets into these sort of existential crises of despair, and oftentimes he'll call me up and he'll be depressed, and I'll ask him, why are you depressed? He says, people still believe in religion. Will it ever end? And he goes on and on like that. Okay. And I said to him, listen, just so you know, my experience is that for every Jerry Falwell out there are 99,999 Homer Simpsons who sleep in the pews and don't really give a damn one way or the other. Right. And you had said, I think you called it the default state is atheism or agnosticism, non-belief. And I really think that most people don't die. I mean, I've read so many books and talked to people where they say, oh, religion, and like that Boyer book posits that is the default state. But I just really haven't seen it. I think it takes a lot to inculcate someone into any belief system, political, religious, or whatever. Would you agree, Bill?
Kinda, a little bit. I don't know. Boy, I'm getting lost within this. There's so much great thought here. I don't know. I draw a blank right now. I'd have to agree with what I'm find myself agreeing with everybody here.
Homer Simpsonism. I mean,
I think everybody is a Homer Simpson. Yes, like you mentioned. If you look at
speaking of evolving beyond what you were, yeah.
If you look at what's the gentleman's name that does all Barna does all the research on the internet for religious research, he'll state that 85% of the United States will consider themselves Christian. But yet they'll argue the fact that abortion is legal, but how can abortion be legal if 85% of the Americans are Christian? And then they'll say, well, that only 7% are evangelical and 9% are yada yada, and they come up with all these kind of figures. So that the very small, the small right, like the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons and Janet Parshalls and whoever else that's out there, seem to have such a large voice, but they're such a small group.
They just shout really loud.
They just shout
very
really
vocal,
loud.
very well managed, and very well financed.
Exactly,
Right,
very well
okay.
financed. And whereas the rest of the people don't really want to listen to it or don't hear it, they don't or hear it, but they just don't want to hear it, just because it's out there. And I think, like, especially the atheists and the rest of them need a good, strong, solid group. Not really a church or something like that, but somehow a group to get that same kind of strong voice, to get that radio airplay, to get these kind of ideas, this great thought out on the air, to get money backing it, to get schools for children, to build homes, to do everything that churches and religions do. Because we can sit here and talk about all the negatives of religion, but religion has also done an awful lot of positive. And I think if some of this great thought that's coming out of here tonight can develop some of that great possibilities for society, I think you'd win over a lot more hearts than mere conversation.
Go ahead, Blair.
I was going to say 2 points real quick. Well, one, to make your friend feel a little better. Over the past 35 years, they've tracked religiosity worldwide for the first time. It used to be, religion in the U.S., religion in Britain, whatever. And 35 years ago, they started to track religion worldwide and to see how much adherents were growing or decreasing. Judaism has pretty much been stagnant, and the reason, of course, is because Judaism is more of a hereditary religion. You're born into Judaism; it's very hard to convert to it.
It's also
Islam
not. It's also.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's also not a religion that proselytizes and tries to win converts.
True. Right. Absolutely true. And Islam, I think, increased. I'm trying to go by memory on the numbers here. I think Islam increased by like 1.8%. Christianity increased by 0.3% worldwide. But the fastest growing, quote-unquote, religion was free thought, atheism, agnosticism at over 125% worldwide.
Well, just a
Sure,
thought.
never know it.
Most of the Jewish babes I know prefer Gentiles, so that's one of the reasons Judaism has stagnated. But
well, the Catholic Church has officially declared Ireland and the UK to be pagan states. To be, they're sending over like mass amounts of missionaries there over now because they realize that 80% of the population do not believe in a personal God.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, I need to move to Britain.
Ireland has always been appealing. I'm of Irish ancestry, so I could go for that one easily. Yeah.
Well, Bill, you had just mentioned talking about religion doing a lot of good, and I'm sort of come see, come saw on that. At the group that I met you at, I had debated the merits of Mother Teresa, and a lot of people, even non-religious people, hold her up as some kind of a saint. And I always point to the fact that, and I did a lot of research on her on the internet from some ex-nuns of hers, and this is a woman that basically was basically a psychotic. She was divorced from the reality. And when I say psychotic, I don't mean Ted Bundy knife wielding. I mean someone who's divorced from reality.
Psychologically disconnected.
Right. And she and this was a woman, and I don't have the videotape, but I remember as a child clearly seeing during the Nicaragua earthquake of 77 or 78, seeing a documentary on this woman, and she was teasing in the hospitals back in when they got back to India. She was holding out pieces of bread to starving children. The Hindus she'd feed, but the Muslims, she'd make them say something in Hinduist. Now you can say, well, okay, she may have eventually given them the bread after the cameras went off or whatnot, but people wonder why a Ted Bundy exists or a Hitler exists or something, but it's these little acts of evil that are facilitated by trying to get someone to just give that little bit of their soul. So, okay, maybe she does feed people. Maybe she did help some people here and there. But, even a lot of doctors that I researched said that her methods for treating illnesses were, a little above barbarism.
Right. And she would also a lot of times demand that the patient either convert to Christianity or at least pay homage to Christ via prayer before she would even treat them.
Yeah, well, in that she's no different than any missionary.
Right.
Yeah.
And to just jump in there real quick, as far as that is one individual, and yes, there might be some awful bad aspects about her, and I don't know that much about her, and I'm sure it's all true. But for the masses and the majority, when I talk about the good that some of the religion does, some of the religion in history has done some good. Islam has done some good as far as
science and mathematics.
Science, mathematics, translation of books, languages.
Right. Until they turned in on themselves.
Yeah, until they collapsed. I don't know what the hell happened to that. That's the most threatening religion I think we have today. I think it's more threatening than Christianity is in America. But nevertheless, they have offered that for society in the past. I think Christians have offered some stuff as far as social programs. Yes, they want to convert you, but if you could get rid of the conversion process of it, what they offer, I think is pretty good.
Let's throw a philosophy loop in there. Is it a good deed if the only reason you're doing it is to gain favor for a God so you can get rewarded with an afterlife?
That's a good point.
Right. Very good point.
And if we could get away from that, somehow communicate that to other people to help.
Why should I worship a deity that's never manifested itself to me? You know, I've suffered from medical problems throughout my life. I've had losses here and there, job losses. I've lost people that I was close to that were cut down in their prime. You know, I mean, if there were a God, I mean, this is the kind of philosophical little things that I know Bill is familiar with me arguing that, just tend to not get beyond religious.
Well, and even beyond that, and I would argue that this is yet a third cause for the formation of religions. I personally have had many, people would call them mystical or transcendental experiences, visionary experiences in my lifetime. A lot of my poetry, it's all through there. You can read that on the web. But I was raised in the Lutheran Church, and I left it behind because here I was this, 9-year-old kid who was having these transcendent experiences of being enveloped in light, and it wasn't like angels. It was very, very non-physical and stuff. And they were like, we don't know what to do with that, because modern Lutheranism is a hyper-rational, very, very left-brain religion. They don't really have much spirituality left, and they have no mysticism whatsoever. Most of the
black and white.
Well, it's not so much that it's black and white. It's just that most of the Protestant religions, like the Lutherans and the Methodists and the ones that were the older splits from the Catholic Church in the Reformation era in the 16th century, that was the start of that whole biblical literalism that led to what we have the fundies now, but it was also the start of rational religion versus heart-centered religion. It's head-centered religion. So it's like, we have these rules and these theologies, and this is the way it must be because we've thought it out through logically and scientifically, rather than, I have faith that this is the way it must be. So here I was having these mystical experiences, and nobody could explain them, and I thought I ended up in an insane ward until in my late 20s when I met somebody who actually said, no, what you're perceiving is correct, it's just that nobody told you about it. And now what I've done in the intervening years is I've done a thorough reading of all the mystical literature that I can get my hands on, thousands of books from different world cultures, and I personally believe that at the heart of every one of these organized religions, the original thing was a mystical transcendental experience that was shared by one or a small group of people who then started to talk about it. And all the organizational stuff was never done by the founders. Christ did not found Christianity. Buddha did not found Buddhism.
Right.
Shiva, the people who wrote the Rig Veda did not, and the Upanishads did not found Hinduism. That stuff comes later when you have an organizer. I thoroughly believe that St. Paul founded Christianity.
Right, me too.
And he was a screwed up guy. Come on. He was a misogynist.
There's a huge difference between Christianity and Pauline Christianity.
Exactly.
Too. But, it's unfortunate that organized religion has hijacked the word spirituality.
Precisely, yeah.
Well, L. Ron Hubbard and Joseph Smith are two guys who started their religions for money. One was a plagiarist, Smith, who plagiarized the novel, and L. Ron Hubbard was a bad sci-fi guy who started a religion on a bet.
Yeah.
And not to mention Anton LaVey, who I should say Satanism.
Actually, Anton LaVey founded Satanism as a joke. It is not, in fact, a religion.
Right. But it is one of the best criticisms of religion you'll ever read.
Well,
people took it seriously, though, but it's a very well-written and funny book.
And it's Yeah,
it's great.
It's great. It's satire.
Yeah.
And if you read it as such, it's hilarious.
Right.
Send the hate mail to Art Durkee. I'll give you your address.
No. Send it to Dan. Send it to Dan.
Just be glad you're up north and not down here. Let me
Yeah, you're not on the Bible Belt down there.
Oh, I know I would have been burned at the stake down there.
It's absolutely ridiculous. I've had Bibles left on my front porch. We had a cross planted in the yard.
A burning cross?
No, not a burning cross.
Oh, okay.
No. I haven't pissed off the KKK yet. The SPLC bankrupted them. They're pretty much gone.
Let me tell you, Blair. In 20 or 30 years, I'm gonna have a book that's going to be a bestseller called "Emails from Idiots," and Art has seen many of them. And whether it's around whether
we're archiving all of them,
whether it's threats or stuff on poetry. But let me switch gears a little bit, because one of the things that I know I had did an essay last year where I tend to consider myself a raging moderate on most things, and I don't like left-wingers, for example, who try to shill for someone like a Mamiya Abu-Jamal, and I don't like right-wingers who'll try to shill for an Eric Rudolph. To me, they're both killers, they're both scum, and I'd fry both of them. But I want to talk about fanaticism too, and when I think of atheism, there are two fairly well-known fanatic atheists that I'm hoping that you're going to disavow. The one would be Ayn Rand, who was the novelist who then considered herself an atheist and formed a group that called the Objectivists. And the second one was Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who is probably most associated with atheism, modern atheism, through her talk show appearances, and then she died a few years back, or was murdered.
She got murdered,
or with some kind of financial scam or something. And I don't know. I'm sure you're not related to those groups, but I don't know if you have any opinions on either of those two individuals, Blair.
Well, I am. The Mobile Atheist is affiliated with American Atheists, which was Madalyn O'Hair's group. Of course, it's no longer her group. It's now run by Ellen Johnson, who is not as radical as Madalyn Murray O'Hair. But what's funny is the persona that Madalyn Murray O'Hair put out to the public was not who she really was. If you talk to her friends and family, she was the most laid-back, peaceful grandmother image you could ever imagine. She sat in her house, she chilled back, she drank her sweet tea and lemonade, and she chit-chatted, she loved her kids. It wasn't until she got out in public and realized that she needed to be more brisk, more in your face in order to get attention. That's the persona that she put out to the public, but that wasn't really who she was. And unfortunately, that persona painted a rather negative light for the atheist movement, because everybody looked at her like, God, they're all freaks. And that was unfortunate. And atheists are still dealing with that issue even to this day. I mean, she's still blamed as the woman that kicked God out of school, which is really funny, because if you go back and look at the Supreme Court case, nowhere is O'Hair mentioned.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's interesting, too, because her son wrote a book called Growing Up Without God, where he talked about how he was raised as basically a teenage activist with her, and then he converted to born-again Christianity later and disavowed it and claimed that she had spiritually abused him as a child.
Right, yeah. And, of course, he's,
But he did that for a purpose, I know.
Right. Everybody that's read his book that knows her and hung around her family is basically called him a liar.
Okay.
Well, let me just ask you, just going off on a tangent, regarding the foundation of this country. People have always said this is a Christian nation, and when you talk about her kicking O'Hair having kicked God out of the classrooms, it wasn't until, 1911 that In God We Trust, I think, came on?
No, it came in the 50s under McCarthy.
Well, it was put on the coins. It was put on the 2-cent coin in 1901.
Right, okay.
It was put on the rest of the coins around 1911, 1912. It wasn't put on money until 1955, I think.
That's what I was thinking. That's the paper money.
And then it was put in the pledge and the national motto in 1954.
Right.
And clearly for Christian purposes. Dwight D. Eisenhower was not vague at all when he said why he wanted In God We Trust to be the motto and to be on.
Nor was he alone.
He wanted us to the United States to look like a Christian nation against the communist Soviets.
Yeah, the quote godless communists.
Godless communists, right.
Yeah.
But the original founders were deists. Now, a deist believes in a deity, hence the name,
but not a personal God.
Right, but I don't. As far as I've ever read, most of the founding fathers were certainly not what would be considered fundamentalist Christians. They were.
Well, there's some confusion. Well, one, you got to clarify what you're talking about when you're talking about founding fathers. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I found out when I get into debates with Christians over the establishment of the country is when they talk about founding fathers, they're talking about the actual 55 delegates that signed the the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And of those 55 delegates, 53 were Christian. But half the groups, half the membership there were part of churches that later went away. They don't even exist anymore. And many of them, what we found out when we did more research into it, and one of the people that did some really good research into it was a man called Gene Garman. He wrote a book called America's Real Religion on the separation of church and state and the constitutional delegates. And most of these guys, what happened is because they were forced to be baptized in a church, that church claimed them, even though they never really attended the church.
Right.
And so you find out, okay, well, these guys were Baptists. No, they were baptized in a Baptist church, but they weren't practicing Baptist, or they weren't practicing Catholics. And so you have to establish, what are you talking about founding fathers? Are we talking all the way back to the Revolutionary War, or just those 55 delegates? And if you go back to Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, et al., you're talking more about deists. I mean, those are people that came out of the Enlightenment age, that were they were naturalists or they were Jesusians. Thomas Jefferson is a good example. He was a great Jesusian. He believed in the ethic of Jesus, but he thought that whole metaphysical crap all around it needed to go, so he rewrote the Bible,
right?
Which you can still go to the library and get today. Benjamin Franklin was a deist, but he also accepted the Jesusian concept as well, that Jesus was an ethical person, and you should take some of that out of there. But he also took some of the Islamic religion out as well, and said there's some good stuff in there too. You know, he didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater just because he disagreed with some of the book. He still took some of the good parts out of it that he thought could build a moral code for himself.
Well, Blair, let me just ask you. You talk about Jesus and whatnot. Was there ever really a Jesus? I've never read a single book that there's ever been any physical proof or any contemporaneous substantiation that there ever was a person named Jesus at that time. There have been other people who claim to have been the Son of God both prior to the quote Jesus and then afterwards. And I mean, you know, I think there's more historical support for King Arthur than there is for Jesus.
Yeah, there's absolutely no proof whatsoever that a man named Jesus ever existed. You look at
despite a couple of months ago, wasn't there like the tomb of the brother of Jesus supposedly?
Yeah, which is really funny because it says here lies James, brother of Jesus, or something to that effect. That would not be written on a tomb way back then. One, his name would not be James. People didn't use names like James and Paul back then. Those are contemporary English names that we've assigned to Aramaic and Hebrew names.
Right.
There was no Jesus. He would have been Yeshua.
Yosef, Yeshua.
And Yeshua, yeah.
Right.
Yosef,
so
Yeshua.
When it says here lies James, and it just seems kind of funny that it came from a shop owned by an Islamic. And here's what I've been hiding for the last 30 years. Thought you guys might like to want it.
and maybe you might know, but does anyone still believe in the Shroud of Turin being the burial cloth, or is that?
Oh yeah, people still believe that.
But that wasn't that. Didn't even the Catholic Church disavow that in the late 80s?
No, the Catholic Church still. They're
the ones that lock it up.
Yeah, they're the ones that own it. They're the ones that keep it under lock and key. Matter of fact, when they did the DNA testing, a long time. What was it? 6-7 years ago now.
It was about.
They did the DNA testing.
Actually,
the Catholic
about 12
Church
years
decided
ago.
that DNA testing was basically showing it to be a fake, so they wouldn't allow any more samples to be taken.
Right.
I saw somebody recreate the whole thing anyway.
Right.
Well,
you take the face off of it, and it's like a face that would belong to no one. If you saw a man walking around with those dimensions on his face, the first word out of your mouth would be, "Oh my God, look at that freak!"
Well, plus, that the real picture of Jesus would be in a very short, timid Semitic man,
right?
With dark curly hair.
No, we all know Jesus was a white Caucasian with blue eyes,
and very dark skin. I mean, even in the book that they claim themselves that you read in the Bible says, where is he? They had difficulty picking him out of a crowd because he didn't stand out as a large figure.
Right.
Well, let me wrap up this section here. I want to read a paragraph from another book, and then we're going to outro and come back with a last section. But the book I want to read from, speaking of faces, Faces of Jesus, also another belief that's great is the face on Mars. And I've got a book by a fellow named Bruce Rux, and I believe it's a self-published book, and it's called Hollywood versus the Aliens. I just want to read a paragraph from it because even though it's not talking about religion, when I read this, I think you'll see a lot of the kind of logical fallacies that are used to support this fellow's belief in a government conspiracy on UFOs. And by listening to the silliness there, think about how the same kind of terms are used in religious debate. But anyway, this is from the introduction, page 22 of Hollywood versus the Aliens. Now, it references the movie Stargate, which was a movie in the 1990s with James Spader.
James Spader.
And having to do with Egypt and the pyramids and time travel, blah, blah, blah.
Good movie, actually.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
But anyway, here's the paragraph. In real life, the plot of Stargate appears to have played out the fate of the numerous Mars probes, most notably the Soviets' Phobos 1 and Phobos 2 and Mars 96, and the United States Observer. For that matter, the Egyptian connection to the planet Mars has been an open secret for more than a quarter of a century. Anyone with more than a passing interest in space knows that NASA probes to Mars have photographed what appear to be configurations of pyramids in two separate locations of the planet, Elysium and Cydonia. The Elysium pyramids were photographed in the Trivium Charontis area by Mariner 9 at two separate times and lighting angles on frames 4205-78 on February 8, 1972, and 4926-236 months later. They appear to be regularly spaced, three-sided pyramids in rhombus formation, the two large of which were 2 miles across and half a mile high. Quote, given the present lack of any easily acceptable explanation, wrote David Chandler of the structures in Life on Mars, there seems to be no reason to exclude from consideration the most obvious conclusion of all. Perhaps they were built by intelligent beings. And that's the section. Now, the reason, the whole book here, and it's a wonderfully ridiculous book of about 600 pages that goes on with that kind of logic, but it's a kind of circular kind of logic that, someone said this, therefore it must be that, and if it looks like a duck, it must be a duck that was planted by aliens, and you get into this whole Eric von Däniken kind of logic.
It quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it must be a duck.
The most interesting book I've ever read on UFOs was actually one of Carl Jung's, the famous psychologist and student of Freud's, last books that he wrote towards the end of his life. It's called Flying Saucers. Yeah. And he basically did a cultural, psychological analysis of the entire culture of the whole UFO thing, and he wrote this post Roswell, so this was not like in the 30s.
He had inside information, Art.
Yeah, I know he did. Well, some people would say that Jung was an alien because, after all, he was too brilliant to be a human, right? Mm-hmm. But anyway, but he had some very interesting things to say about why people want to believe in UFOs. Beyond Agent Mulder, and his sister being kidnapped, there's a lot of things, and in fact, what he points out is that some of the things that people do with UFOs are like projections of the same internal psychological images that you read in the book of in the Old Testament of the Bible about Ezekiel and the angels, and Elijah in the desert and talking to the angels, and the images are identical.
And the whole hierarchy.
And the whole right.
It's just funny you should mention that, because one of the things that they were talking about in a book I read, and the title escapes me right now, was that prior to the sci-fi era, when people had sleep paralysis, what they woke and described was, I was visited by an angel.
Yeah, or incubi or succubi.
Started, and suddenly the angels were replaced by aliens.
Right.
Wow. Well, one of these days we'll get Whitley Strieber on, and I'm sure we'll go off on that. But let's.
Hey, Whit's a great guy. I kind of know him. He's cool.
Well, let's end this here, and we're gonna listen to a song that ends with a little hallelujah chorus, and it's from 1970s Saturday Morning. All right, we are back now talking atheism and agnosticism with Bill Gouette and Blair Scott from the Mobile Atheist. Bill, you had a couple of questions that you wanted to direct Blair's way. Why don't you ask a couple?
First one is Blair, thank you for your time this evening. And second is that I noticed you mentioned you do a lot of debate as far as creation and evolution, and creationism seems to be be building quite rapidly, and it seems to be driven by a fraud named Hovind. What do you think of that gentleman?
It's funny you should mention him, because he lives about 45 miles from my house.
Does he really?
Yeah, Ken Hovind runs the Creation Science Ministry out of Pensacola, Florida.
Yeah, the Dr. Dino deal.
Dr. Dino.
Yeah, I had a gentleman that...
is he the one who found the man tracks, supposedly?
Yeah, that's a whole other story.
Oh, sorry, okay.
There's no evidence of humans with dinosaurs to begin with.
Right.
But,
he's oh boy, he's...
But anyway, there's a discussion between an atheist and himself, and somebody passed the information on to me. So I'm just curious to know what you think of the gentleman before I listen to this.
Well, we've tried to debate a couple times, and the first time we tried to debate, I ended up going out of town, and the second time he was unable to commit. And finally, I decided I'm not going to debate him after he's been arrested several times, and there's been no conviction, so I can't say he's guilty. but he's been arrested a few times over a permit. He refuses to get a permit for the building that he's constructing because he says he doesn't have to pay it because he follows God's law, not man's law. And he was arrested for an altercation with some of his tenants. And, you know, the one witness that said he didn't do anything just happens to be an employee of his church. And what's funny is if you call down there, they don't deny it at all. They say, yeah, he was arrested, but this is what really happened. And they give a completely opposite story of what the sheriff wrote. So I decided not to debate him, that I didn't want to associate myself with someone that
Somebody like
constantly
that.
gets arrested.
And what about his credentials? I hear that they don't stand up.
No, they don't stand up.
He doesn't even have a doctorate.
He got his degree from Patriot University, which is you write a big essay, you send them a couple $100, and they give you a degree. He does not have a legitimate degree. And what's funny, under Florida law, technically he's violating the law by calling himself Dr. Hovland, because you can only call yourself a doctor under Florida law if you've been to an accredited university.
Right. That's right. Okay.
Well,
it kind of leaves out all his credibility, don't it?
Right. And then, of course, you got Ken Ham.
Yeah.
And then you've got Dwayne Gish, who I've had the pleasure, if you want to call it that, of meeting in Mobile at Dolphin Way Baptist Church. Him and Massimo Pigliucci went at it one night. Mobile Atheist sponsored Massimo down there, and that was interesting. I mean, Dwayne Gish I think he's actually getting ready to retire, if not already retired. But he's using the same arguments that he was using in like the 70s. His debate hasn't changed at all. He never brings new information. And he once said, if you ever find a fish with legs, then I will believe in evolution.
Right.
So that night, Massimo brought in a brand new species that they found. It was a fish with legs.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And he just sat there befuddled and didn't say anything, you know?
well, I mean, that's the same kind of nonsense. What was it, the tracks in Pascagoula that supposedly were human footprints, but it turned out to be, you know, some bipedal dinosaurs with just a little wear and whatnot. But, I mean, religion to me is all about money and power. And in that regard, I mean, religion is just a subset of any kind of idea systems. I mean, it's generally about, you know, trying to get people to conform so that you can have power to say they can do this or that. But Bill here is holding a book called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, and Art had wanted to...
Yeah, this is a book that Eric Hoffer wrote, I believe, in 1951. It was first published. Hoffer, for those you don't know, he called himself a longshoreman philosopher. He made his living working on the docks of San Francisco, but then he wrote a series of, I believe, 6 or 7 little books that are all mind bombs. 50 years later, they're still relevant. And basically... The True Believer is an analysis of the psychology of both the person, both of the individual, and the cultural forces that create fanatics. Right. And his definition of a fanatic is totally, if I can borrow the term, ecumenical. He believes that, as Dan has said before, the people on the extreme left who are fundamentalists, the people on the extreme right who are fundamentalists, anyone who is got that fixed opinion has all the answers and will not listen to any reasonable amount of debate or have somebody without questions, that's a fanatic.
Well, in that instance too, you know, a lot of, I think, Big Bang theory is tinged with some fanaticism.
I personally believe that Stephen Jay Gould and Carl Sagan, who are both popular writers on science, were fanatics, because they were very much promoting an anti-spiritualist, not Christian, not anti-religion, but you know, hardcore rationality. If you can't see it with your 5 senses, not counting your 6 senses, just your 5 senses, then it doesn't exist.
Which is why I think it's important. Which is why I said earlier that I'm always open to possibilities. You know, I think if you show me something, if I can see something that contradicts what I believe, or where my convictions stand, then I will alter those convictions. As I learn new things, my convictions and my ideologies change all the time as I learn new stuff, because if you become static, if you become to the point where you're 100% right, there's nobody can sway you, then you become a fundamentalist.
And that's religion right and religion left.
Right. I mean, there are fundamentalists, just like there are fundamentalists, you know.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, you know, another person that comes to mind that I think of, especially as someone who's a writer and a poet, is Joseph Campbell. And I think Campbell was a very destructive person in terms of the arts, because he was a very fundamentalist. He had this idea that all myth is somehow based on some ineffable truth or whatnot. And he never seemed to be able to grasp the idea that people like to bullshit, basically. And I think to a certain degree, religion probably did start somewhere over a fire, people just, tossing the bull around, and every so often something connected in a core part of someone, and a couple of people got together, and soon you had 6 out of the 10 people of the tribe, and they were the majority, and, it sort of
not only connected on a personal experience, but also connected with their natural experience.
Right.
Yeah, and inertia sort of took over. And so I think Joseph Campbell, as far as art, could not really accept the fact that people had imaginations and that they could think beyond everything. Had to have something.
I think that's really a misreading of Campbell. I mean, I've read a lot of Campbell, and Campbell was very pro art and pro imagination. He was fundamentally a Jungian, and he believed in archetypes. And the whole Jungian theory of archetypes is that there's this thing called the collective unconsciousness that all human beings share on some deep preconscious, pre-verbal level. And these things arise in dreams, and they appear as common patterns in every religion and every culture around the world throughout time. And that's really what it's about. I think if Campbell had a flaw, it's that he tended to oversimplify things because he was an evangelistic popularizer of mythology, rather than, though he had the academic credentials.
Well, I think he greatly oversimplified things. But, getting back to, one of my wife works in the science, and a couple of years ago, my brother-in-law is out. My brother-in-law is one of these big New York-type gorilla kind of guys, and they were arguing about dinosaurs, and it's funny because one of their arguments was something that was mentioned just a few minutes ago. My wife was talking about dinosaurs reproducing, and my brother-in-law, he was saying, "Can you prove to me that dinosaurs had testicles? Were you there? Were you there?" And my wife was going into all the genetic arguments. But at a certain fundamental level, my brother-in-law was dead right. You actually cannot.
There's no tissue.
Well, you cannot 100% prove that. Well, even if they did have, gonads, did they do it? Unless you have a time machine, you can't fundamentally prove it. So
of course, now they've actually found a couple species where the skin, the soft tissue was intact, which is why they were really confused, because there was a 4-chamber heart in the dinosaur. And it was, why did they have a 4-chamber heart, or a 3-chamber heart? Excuse me. And it was like, why did they have a 3-chamber heart? They expected a 4-chamber heart. And so that kind of threw everybody for a loop for a while.
Well, my point, though, is that a lot of times people, when they talk about agnosticism or atheism, they talk about faith and blind faith. But there's a fundamental difference between faith and blind faith.
Right.
And, we all have faith. I have faith that all of this around me is reality, and that I'm not just in a permanent psychotic state.
And you have faith in your wife.
Yeah, but you can't.
Your relationships, you have faith in your friends.
Well, faith is another word that's been hijacked by organized religion. I mean, there's there's different definitions for faith. The main definition of faith that we all tend to associate with is belief in something either in contrary to the evidence or in lack of evidence. But there's also the faith based on consistency as well. I have faith that the sun will rise tomorrow because I've seen it happen a gazillion times.
That's based on experience.
Right, or I have faith in my family.
Right.
Or I have faith in scientific law. Richard Dawkins, I saw him in Berkeley a couple of years ago.
It's the guy who wrote The Selfish Gene.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
And Unweaving the Rainbow, which is one of my favorite books. But what he did is he took a pendulum and he put it next to his nose. And he said, "I'm going to drop this pendulum. Now my instincts, when it comes back, are to jump back." He says, "But I have faith in the laws of physics that it'll stop right where I dropped it off at. And it will not bash my nose. So in my faith in physics, I'm going to stand my ground." And he lets the pendulum go, and it comes back. It comes just short of where he dropped it, and it keeps going. And he said, "So I do have faith. I just don't have faith in lack of evidence or faith in contrary to the evidence." So it's unfortunate that religion has hijacked the word faith.
Mm-hmm. Well, this show, I mean, we're talking about agnosticism and atheism, but really I wanted the show to be about religion from the outside, and to talk from these two perspectives from the outside. Let me just ask a couple of questions, though, and as an outside observer, it seems to me that most religions, fundamentalist or not, tend to have a problem with human sexuality in all its various forms. And I'm wondering...
The pagans don't.
Well, but where do you think that comes from? I've always been of the opinion, for example, that like the Roman Catholic pedophilia scandals are based on sexual repression, not given a choice. Not that I'm a big Bob Guccione fan, but I'd rather be stuck on an island with Guccione than Jerry Falwell.
Pat Robinson.
Yeah. So I mean, do you have any any ideas, though, why a lot of religions, not even those that are that hardcore, have these, sort of bizarre ideas about sexuality?
Blair, is this an Abrahamic religion problem rather than a world religion problem?
I'd say probably 75% yes. I mean, because, you look at man, I am brain farting here big time.
Well,
the Kama Sutra.
Right.
You look at the Kama Sutra, they obviously don't have a problem with sexuality. Hinduism does not have a problem with sexuality.
Yep.
Buddhism does not have a problem with sexuality. Although, in all fairness, I should say that Buddha said that in order to achieve the ultimate karma and to achieve nirvana, that you should refrain from sexuality because sexuality was a lust and it was
it's an attachment, just like every other desire.
But this whole aversion to sexuality just really befuddles me. And what's funny is if you look at it, the lack of premarital sex, premarital cohabitation, the lack of sexual exploration in the fundamentalist religion mindset has actually contributed to the major increase in fundamentalist divorces. Yeah, I mean, the Christian religion is the highest divorce rate. Actually, I won't say that. Judaism has the highest divorce rate at 33%, but Southern Baptists are the highest at 29%. And, of course, the lowest divorce rate is among agnostics and atheists who have no hang-ups at all about sexuality. You go to Europe, and they don't seem to have a problem with sexuality.
Well,
I lived in Italy for 5.5 years, the heart of the Vatican, and why the Vatican itself had a problem with sexuality, Italy didn't.
Well, that's partly because, Europe sent a lot of the people who were religious.
Puritanical.
Well, the Puritans as one group, but also the Shakers and others. I mean,
Right.
Europe kicked out during the colonial period and pre and post-colonial period. They kicked out all the people who were essentially religious, extremists, because they didn't want them at home, like the Huguenots and all those people. They either killed them or kicked them over here.
Right.
So we as the United States, as a culture, inherited that strain of Puritanism about the mind-body divorce, the sin of the flesh, the body is evil and all that. Most of those fanatics ended up over here rather than staying in Europe.
And we still have the puritanical baggage left over to deal with, where the rest of the world seems to kind of forgotten about it, with the exception, of course, for Islamic states, but even Islamic states, I mean, it's okay in some Islamic countries to have more than one wife.
Right.
So, I mean, even they don't have as much of a sexual hang-up as Christianity does, at least American Christianity.
Okay, well, I just want to add that I think why I have a problem with sexuality is that since people tend to want to hang on to the book, the Bible, as being inspired word of God, and it's kind of ingrained within society that's what they're supposed to expect, since that's what's in there about sexuality, they kind of take that to heart and put that into laws around us. So that's why they have such a problem with it. Mostly Levitical law and the rest of it. One of the things that I always have the biggest problem I come over with when I talk about religion and sexuality is I always ask somebody, I says, well, okay, if Jesus was conceived by Mary, he was either conceived out of wedlock or in wedlock. I mean, either God had sexual intercourse with a married woman or unmarried woman. It's either or. So, I mean, there's a problem with sexuality right there. But when you start talking about whether the Bible is truthful and factual or whether it's fictional, I think is where we run into problems on whether it's divinely inspired. So if they think it's divinely inspired, they're going to pass all these laws that say it's bad. But there's nothing wrong. In the natural world, within the animal kingdom, there's nothing wrong with sexuality.
Well, when did celibacy come into the Catholic Church? 12th, 13th century? Something?
Yeah, celibacy came into the Catholic Church as an issue of greed.
Yeah.
The problem they were having was that as the clergy were having children, the churches were inherited by those children. The church wasn't getting the property or any of the money out of the coffer. And so they decided that the priest could not be married so that the church would inherit the property and the money out of the coffer.
And what year was this approximately?
6th century.
I want to say late 1200s, early 1300s.
No, it was earlier than that. It was a little bit earlier than that.
Yeah. Maybe okay. Yeah, it was late 12s, early 13s when I think Pope Pius or Pope Sextus. Actually, it's funny his name was Sextus, considering the topic. But, he tried to actually change it, and he was overruled by the bishops.
Right.
Well, I thought the Catholic priests wanted to get away from having wives and families because they wanted somebody. They wanted their congregation, everybody, when they want to look up to a priest, to be solely committed to God and nobody else.
Oh, that was the baloney apologetics that came up after the fact.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of funny that the whole aversion to sexuality based on the Bible, considering it says be fruitful and multiply.
Right.
Well, let me just ask you, Blair, and also Bill and Art can opine too. To a certain degree, I think that the Y2K mania of a few years back, to me, was sort of like the last great worldwide religious or wacky kind of evangelical kind of trauma, and I think that come 100 years from now, in 2103, I think most religions will be in a serious state of decline. I think when we have cyber technology, when people, when they're feeling depressed, don't have to go to church, but can, plug something into their mind and be having sex with some Playboy playmate, or can be, having adventures, or, on the moon, or, in some sporting event with their favorite all-time team or something.
Am I the only one looking forward to the hologram deck?
Yeah, Star Trek. And I want to take it one step further.
Oh, no, you're not the only one.
I want to take it one step further than that. Not only was just 100 years with sexuality and everything else as far as our social customs, but with the human race altogether. We are this planet is destined to die. We must leave. We are a species that must survive, and we are going to have to leave this planet because it will die. Whether it's 10 billion years from now, it will die. Right. We have the possibilities now to alter DNA and structures to create new species of humans to colonate the universe so that we may survive. So in essence, we will be our own gods, creating our own species that will populate the entire universe in order for us to survive.
What's funny is...
Because we're all doomed to die.
Right. What's funny is about the whole issue with saving the planet and environmentalism and trying to at least stay here as long as we possibly can, is that religiosity is like the nemesis to that. I don't know how many times I've seen Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson on TV say they could give a crap about the environment because Jesus is coming back.
Right.
It's what... they call it Armageddonomics, this whole idea that it doesn't matter what we do, it doesn't matter what policies we have, it doesn't matter what damage we do to the planet, what damage we do to the species, because Jesus is coming again. There will be a second coming, there will be an Armageddon, and you got to wonder how much foreign policy and domestic policy is manipulated by, politicians that have this mindset that, well, it doesn't matter because Jesus is coming.
Well, do you think, though, religion is on the decline in 100 years, 200 years? Do you see the trends,
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, me too.
I think religion is on decline. Right now you're seeing the watering down of mainstream religion. Look at Christianity. Now they got, you just look at the Christian music. Now you got hip-hop Christian music, rap Christian music, country and Western Christian music.
That's just
being
wrong.
Watered down.
It's just wrong.
Yeah, and if you just look at all the Christian denominations, they keep
being
dividing.
Watered down.
It's exponentially dividing out of control.
The thing, too, is, I look at, just in the last couple of 100 years, things like spiritualism in the 19th century and other such things throughout the 20th century. It seems to me that a lot of these more sort of wacky, spiked out versions of what was the central religions, to me, is something that seems to be in a death throes kind of mode.
Well, it's indicative of a big paradigm shift. And there are a lot of people who believe that the whole species, the whole planet, all the cultures, every individual are all going through this major, I guess you could call it the adolescence of the species. But before we were, that whole sheep herder mentality for, the religious leaders guiding the flock is appropriate if you're dealing with mental 2-year-olds. But now the species is going through adolescence and starting to think for itself. And maybe in a few hundred years, if we don't commit suicide, we'll actually have an adult sort of mindset and be able to deal with this. Right. And part of that transition is moving away from these hierarchical, fundamentally tribal religions towards individual spirituality. I think that individual spirituality, personal relationships with whatever you want to call it, the divine or like that, I think that's a birthright that we all have and always will have. But what form it's expressed in, I do agree, is changing radically and fast. And I think one of the things that's going on with the fundamentalists right now is they're scared.
Right.
They're losing their power. They're losing their control.
They're losing their power, and things are changing so fast. I mean, it's the reactionary thing about the whole thing about family values is purely reactionary. Well, it has nothing to do with promoting family values. It's just that we think things were better under Joe McCarthy in the 50s, and when we think that you should be forced to agree with us.
They're trying to save their way of life.
Well,
basically.
I'm still waiting for like the third prophecy from the Our Lady of Fatima incident in 1917 in Lisbon or something, whatever that was. I don't know whether it's going to be that or like when the ice shifts in 2012. That book, with
Christmas Eve 2011.
Talk about prophecy. Just watch the Trinity Broadcasting Network. Well, they got a prophecy every week, and it never happens.
Because we went through the Stone Age, we went through the Iron Age, maybe now we're ending the Rational Age.
Well, maybe.
Let me just wind up this show here. We've got a couple of minutes left, and we're going to end out the segment with a selection from a fellow named Charles Ives called The Unanswered Question. But before we do, there was a line that I ended a sonnet of mine with, and the line went like this: greater than transcendence is its recognition. And I often use this when I speak to young artists to say that it's one thing to paint a great painting or to write a great poem, but you have to understand what makes it great. Otherwise, you're just throwing darts at the dartboard. And I think when I think about religion, I think in order to understand why you might have a spiritual experience, you have to understand human nature, you have to understand your own nature. And if you do, and you have a good sense of yourself, you're not going to be prone to have these kind of belief systems that, invoke witches or gods or demons or this and that. And so that's just my take. Blair, thanks for being our guest. And do you have any final statement if you want?
I think we pretty much covered it all. The only thing I would add to your statement that you just made is I didn't recognize myself as a spiritual person until a couple years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think that may have been a fear of the hijacking of the word, but I do recognize the spirituality. I mean, I just don't attribute to God or a deity to it. I recognize that that's all biological. I mean, it's my recognition of that biological. There's got to be a reason I'm biologically inclined to be spiritual, that I'm willing to embrace it.
And when we put the show online, we'll link to your website. Would you give your URL for the Mobile Atheists?
The Mobile Atheist is atheist.home.att.net. And then Atheism Awareness is atheismawareness.home.att.net.
Okay, and Bill Gouette, you have a final statement?
Not really. I got so many of them. I think I'm finally just starting to open up. Got a lot of great questions to ask.
It's an endless topic.
I thank you, Blair, for being here tonight. Art, it was a pleasure meeting you. This is a great discussion. I hope it continues. I hope we have many more programs like this. I think there's even deeper and more complex issues we can get at. And I hope we can get there someday.
And Art, before we get into your music, we'll let Art intro the piece. But let me just state, next month, if you're offended by this show, or
you'll love next
month because we're going to be talking about race and racism. And I'll tell you, I had several people. We'd hoped to have Michael Shermer from Skeptics.com here, but he couldn't do the show at the last minute. But I've had a lot of people who are a lot of notable Black and African American journalists and professors that I wanted to get on the show, but didn't want to do the show because I wasn't going to let them get away with a lot of their own kind of BS. But if you find this show offensive, you'll love next month's show. So tune in then. And Art, if you want to tell us how we're going to end the show.
Well, we just mentioned that it's such an endless topic that we're actually going to end with a piece of music that kind of evokes the fact that this is an endless topic. One reason I like this piece of music is because it leaves things open-ended and it goes towards mystery and the fact that some of these questions, well, we really can't answer them. So at some level, what do you do? This is a piece called The Unanswered Question by American composer Charles Ives. This is a piece originally written in 1906 and later revised, and it's probably Ives' most famous single composition. It's an exploration of spiritual rather than mundane experience. Ives superimposes widely different musical layers going on here. There's a group of strings that are playing slowly changing chords in G major, representing what Ives called the silence of the Druids, who know, see, and hear nothing. And then a solo trumpet intones what Ives calls the perennial question of existence, a curving atonal melody that is repeated 7 times throughout the piece. The woodwinds, the flutes, oboes, and clarinets, search for an answer to the question, becoming louder, faster, more frenetic, more urgent, and more kind of like, I don't know what to do, as the piece goes on. But the question remains unanswered, and finally they give up, stick their noses out, mock the question, and disappear. The question sounds one more time, and the strings fade into nothingness.
Well, with that kind of a build-up, Art, it better be a goddamn good song.
It's a great, it's a great piece of music.
And we'll be back next month with more controversy, music, and offensive behavior.
Thanks to all of our guests, Charles Ives, the